Welcome back to the blog. This is part two of my series of writings on musings on Book of Genesis and prayer. So I'd like to start with a quote from a book that I mentioned yesterday, The Soul of Prayer by P.T. Forsyth. He says, if we take the wings of morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the earth, God still besets us behind and before. We still feel the collision of past and future, of conduct and conscience. If we try to escape from his presence there, we fail. The winds are his messengers, the fires his ministers, wars and convulsions instruments of his purpose. He is always confronting us, judging us, saving us in a spiritual world which nature does not stifle, but only makes it more universal and impress than our personal strife. I'm not going to pretend that I understand everything that Forsyth is saying there, everything that he is whispering, if indeed he ever whispered, but I do think that the part I understand is where he says that we cannot escape God. I also understand the part where he says we simply cannot escape God's confrontation. God will come to us. He will make us lift our head and face him. He will speak to us using whatever means is necessary to wake us from our sleep. God uses all these means, winds, fires, wars, convulsions, and I suppose much more besides, to speak to us. But I noticed that for the first 35 chapters of Genesis, God spoke to people. I think sometimes he spoke to them face to face, maybe chapter 3, sometimes through a mediator, chapter 18, sometimes through a dream, chapter 20, sometimes through messengers, chapters 19 and 21. He spoke to men, to women. He spoke to Abraham and Abimelech. He spoke to Cain and Noah, kings and servants. He listened. Sometimes he called them by name. Abraham, he said. Jacob. And other times he never addresses them by name at all, perhaps Adam and Eve. And when God speaks to his people or to any people, he speaks in various ways. He reassures, he questions, he debates, he commands, he instructs, he challenges, he judges. He promises, he confronts, and I think that, again, we'll see more. Whatever else might be said, God confronts people in conversation at exactly the place where they are. He meets Hagar in the wilderness twice. He meets Adam and Eve in the cool of the day in the garden. He meets Cain in a field. He meets Abimelech in his palace in a dream. He meets Abraham on a mountain as he's about to slaughter his son again. There's more, but these are just a few of the places where we see God, directly coming into the life of a person and speaking with them. I find it amazing that this book of Genesis, the first book introducing us to the ways of God, to the plan of God, and the purposes of God, spends so much of time in its pages telling us how God so often condescended to speak to humanity. I think all of these prayers in Genesis reveal to us something about ourselves, warnings perhaps, but even more, they demonstrate something to us about God and his dealings with humanity. And we are not so far removed from these people, those characters, that we should scoff at these conversations. As Forsyth wrote in another place, he said the Bible is not a sketchbook of past things, nor a picture book of last things. And yet, I think about this God who speaks directly into the ears of those who have ears to hear. And I think, what would it be like if God spoke to us today as he did to Abraham yesterday? And so I wake up someday I wake up and I hear some random morning and I hear, Jerry. And if I did, would I be so inclined to casually reply as Abraham did? Here I am. Or if God called me and said, Jerry, go build this or go build that, as he did to Noah, would I be so obedient? And then I think to myself a little further, does God speak any less verbally to me than he did to Abraham, to Jacob, to Cain, to Adam and Eve, to Noah? He may not necessarily be demanding I sacrifice my children on a mountaintop, but he does truly demand my life, my all, my own sacrifice. And what should should that response be to the one who doesn't demand our children because he gave up his own son? I bow in worship. Well, what I can say is that this is perplexing. There are so many unanswered questions if we just read Genesis, and I can't do that. I need to have some resolution. I cannot rightly contend with unresolved tension. I have a friend who's a musician and who has this difficulty with unresolved chords in a piece of music. So every now and again I like to mess around and just leave a chord suspended. But the answers in the conversations God has with people in Genesis are shortened. We don't find all the resolution that we want in the book of Genesis. We don't find it until much later. I think, for example, there's 4 or 5 unresolved chords just in the account of Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3 that find no resolution, even in the 38 books that follow it. We won't find the kind of resolution until we get to the New Testament and we meet, not for the first time, but surely for the first time most clearly, the person of Jesus. And at the end of the day, we can simply ask the question, why does God talk to them? To us. He could hide, but instead he seeks out Adam, who has hid. He could be silent, but instead he first asks questions and first confronts us. He could restrain himself, but instead he intervenes. He could stay up there, but instead he comes down. He could send us off on our own, but instead he goes with us. He could leave us crying in the wilderness, but instead he makes a way for our salvation too. Why? Why does God get involved? Why does he judge? Why does it seem that when reading the scripture, we are being dogged relentlessly by a God who just won't leave us alone? Well, I think we're going to discover more about that as we move through this series, but I want to end with one final quote from Forsyth from his book, The Justification of God. He says, "That God spared not his own son is a greater shock to the natural conscience than the collapse of civilization and blood would be. For civilization may deserve to collapse, if only because it crucified the Son of God and crucifies him afresh. But if God spared not his own son, he will spare no historic convulsion needful for his kingdom. And if the unspared Son neither complained nor challenged, but praised and hallowed the Father's name, we may worship and bow the head." The Justification of God, page 194. And this is the God who speaks to us and listens to us. This is the God we engage in conversation and prayer. This is the God who will not leave us alone. This is the God who condescends to converse with us, debate us, judge us, comfort us, lead us, guide us, and go with us. This is the unrelenting God who wants to have a relationship with his people. This is the God that we're going to meet as we travel through the book of Genesis and think about the conversations that he had with so many people, conversations that I think are rightly termed prayers. We'll look at these. So come back again soon. I'll be posting again in 3 days on Genesis chapter 3. In the meantime, feel free to subscribe, comment, leave a like, have a conversation. I'm good with any of it. Grace and peace. We'll see you soon.